Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual in Art, a podcast exploring spirituality, consciousness, and the creative process. I'm your host, Martin Benson. All right, y'all. Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual in Art. I have an amazing podcast for you with Amy Lincoln, an incredible painter based in New York. And this conversation went to some pretty awesome places. We started getting pretty nerdy about art and talking a lot about formal qualities in painting, understanding more technique, understanding how colors work together and different kinds of pigments and the importance of like how we limit our color palettes, but yet also explore versatility within them. So a lot of cool stuff for my painters out there, a lot of stuff about that. But then we got into some really deep spaces around sort of the understanding of like the value of what painting can bring to a culture that's so saturated with stuff, right? Like thinking about how we can have anything at the touch of a hand, and yet what it is as people who make art, like what are we adding to this sort of saturated space of material goods, and what is the value of what it is that we do as artists. So a lot of really great questions brought up, a lot of really great ideas, and I think that y'all are going to really enjoy this podcast and really enjoy learning about her work and the magical things that she does with paint. So I hope y'all enjoy. Here's Amy Lincoln. All right, Amy, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to have you here today to talk with you about the work that you do. How's it going?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah,
Yeah, doing well. How about you?
doing really good, and I'm super excited. I've been like looking at your work from afar for some years now, and just always have been super inspired by sort of the way that you tap into like the energy of the natural world, but you do it in a very specific way that kind of like almost separates it from like its natural color. Like you like kind of like have this amazing saturation of color that you use, the sense of luminosity, really like brilliant forms, and the way that you kind of define the features of the natural world in your own sort of distinct way. I really feel like when I look at your work, I feel the energy of the natural world in a way that's very novel for me, which gets me very excited. Anytime I see you post new paintings, I'm like, whoa. So I'm really fascinated by the way that you sort of illustrate this in your paintings. And I was curious if maybe we could start by you sort of speaking about your own personal relationship to the natural world, because it's such like an important part of your subject matter, at least as your work stands these days.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up on the West Coast in Oregon and also visited my dad in California quite a bit. So I would say, I grew up, uh, well, I live in New York City now. So certainly, like, I grew up more surrounded by nature than I am at this point.
Mhm.
I definitely grew up going to the beach a lot. Portland, I grew up in outside of Portland, which is a couple hours inland, but we would go to visit my grandparents who live near the beach at least once a month. And so I think like I have a lot of memories, fond memories of the Oregon coast, especially, or like all of the trees there. I would play in like forest parks near my house. And so, yeah, I think I probably spent time in nature. Not like I grew up in the suburbs, so it wasn't like it was a rural area or anything,
Yeah.
but close enough. Like there were kind of areas nearby that were sort of untouched forest that I would go hang out in. And yeah, like I said, we went to the beach a lot. Uh,
Nice.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and
I
it's
mean, oh, sorry.
uh,
Go ahead. Keep going.
the Oregon beach is not, it's not warm. You're not like swimming. You're just like walking or like maybe wading a little bit in tide pools. But it's pretty cold there year round. So it's more like a like windy gray kind of experience.
Yeah, but it's so magical. Sometimes when things are like overcast, you can see like the definition of things so like intensely. Do you ever get that experience like when you're in that kind of misty space? Like I could imagine the Oregon coast being in most times of the year, with not direct sunlight, no harsh shadows. like really seeing the clarity of nature. I always get amazed when it's like that here in New Orleans and things are freshly blooming and there's no harsh shadows. It's like, boom, the natural world just really reveals its subtlety to me.
Yeah.
What's interesting about like growing up in these natural spaces, because like I feel like I grew up in Kentucky and like
Mm,
I kind of grew up in a definitely an urban space too, but like I had access to these woods that I lived in. I lived in kind of like a nature preserve, and I
mm,
cherish those memories like so much in my life, like being able to grow up connected to a natural space like that I almost could call my own, because like it was in my backyard and I just descended into the forest. And I was
right.
wondering if you had any like distinct memories like as a kid, like of any specific like experience or interaction, like anything distinct that might come to mind where you really felt like this communion with the natural world in like a distinct way. Does anything come to mind for you?
Um, I don't know, not really. I think it was just like I just don't think I mean, I definitely remember this one park that was pretty close to where I lived, where I would go as a kid, and really liking it there. That and it was these kind of like big Douglas fir trees,
Mm-hmm.
and like kind of lots of hills and I think when I was a kid, I probably went to places like that with either with my parents or with other kids. And I think maybe starting in high school, I started to like either walk or run, like go out by myself to
Mm-hmm.
walk or run. And I think that those were sort of important times because I think at that point I kind of realized actually that it really did help me feel better and like sort of alleviate anxiety or
Yeah.
whatever, if issues I was having in high school with friends or whatever. Being in nature, I think I learned. I think it wasn't just being in nature; it was also just like the physical movement, like
Yeah,
walking, and
definitely.
getting out by myself. And so I think at that point, it started to, be a thing that I like relied on
Yeah.
for a sense of like, yeah, just calm and peace and sort of renewal and
Yeah. Almost like a refuge, like
yeah, yeah, like just getting away from like I don't know. Yeah, I mean it's still I would say that's probably when I started the habit of going for walks, which I still do like almost every day.
yeah.
And it is yeah, it's just an important part of like yeah, my mental health.
For sure. Me too. I feel the same way. Like even just like perusing in my backyard and like looking at like what kind of new bugs are arriving or birds or like trying to stay tapped into those spaces, I think is always so helpful.
Yeah.
Were you making a lot of art in high school? Like is that sort of where your kind of creative sort of expression began to kind of manifest, or was it much earlier?
I would say it was earlier. I mean, yeah, like pretty. So I have a brother who's 6 years older, and he drew. We both did a lot of art and also music, and he was like older than me and much better at music than I was, but he also kind of stopped making art when he was in middle school, and at that point, I really realized yeah, I think I was a kid, I was like 6 and I was like, oh, I'm never going to stop. Like I really because and then I think it also became my thing because he sort of was into music. And so
Yeah.
art could sort of be the thing that I was going to be the best at. So
That's
I think
amazing.
there was, what's that?
No, keep going, keep going. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think there was a, kind of a, yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, it was sort of like I liked getting praise for being good at drawing, like I
Mm,
was just always trying to like draw as realistically as I could. And I took
yeah.
art lessons. And so, I mean, I think it was two things. It was like, it was the thing that I was sort of like getting praise for as a kid. But then also, probably closer to middle school or high school, it also became this thing that was like another refuge, and like kind of a way to make myself feel better when I was like having a hard time in
Yeah.
school.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned like music, and like when I look at your paintings, there is in some sense a musical quality to them, the rhythmic quality of the way that you paint, the way that you break apart like values into their subsequent like bands of color to create like
Yeah.
luminosity, but more like in a structured, not like smoothly blended all the time. Like there is this kind of rhythmic musical quality that comes out of your work. Was that ever intentional, or is that just something that kind of like happened because you mentioned having some connection to music as you know when you were younger? It's
Yeah, no,
interesting to see it come in.
yeah. Well, and I did play the piano, like all through, like from when I was like, I don't know, 6 or 7 until I graduated from high school. So I did do music too. I mean, yeah, I do kind of like to think of my work as, I mean, I think one of the things that draws me to landscape or the seascapes is that it does feel sort of, like almost neutral, like the content of it feels a little more neutral. Like I used to paint
Yeah.
portraits and self-portraits, and that always felt like supercharged and
Mm,
like it had all this kind of emotional narrative weight to it that I felt like I was not interested in ultimately. Like I kind of
yeah.
moved away from it because I felt like it wasn't like I wanted them. I guess I think some of it is actually about my experience of making the paintings. Like I
Mm,
wanted them to have this kind of like yeah, more neutral yeah, I think I like almost abstract. Like I love abstract painting and I wanted to have the kind of like I love doing like little details and having sort of a system that I'm working within, like an overall logic, and
hmm.
then all the pieces of it are kind of like part of that logic. And yeah, I mean, like I love Steve Reich, who's I don't know if you're
Yeah, I'm not
familiar. Yeah,
familiar now. I'm gonna write him down.
he's a composer, like a kind of like a I don't know enough about it to like know the right genre, but sort of like John Cage or Philip Glass,
Hmm.
like a kind of
Yeah.
like a you know a like kind of like modern classical composer or something. That's probably not the right words, but yeah, he's sort of like a almost like an early like precursor to like techno music. Like there'll be
Interesting.
yeah, so there'll be acoustic instruments, but they'll be kind of repeating in this way. That's like it's almost like just it's sort of the way that like techno music can work, where you almost like hear something that's repeated again and again and again, and it just like gradually changes a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I love that kind of music, and yeah, and I sort of think of the paintings like I like the paintings to have that in it, like a sort of a repeated idea and like subtle shifts and color. Yeah, so I think there definitely is there are a lot of corollaries to music. Like I guess
Yeah.
music without words, maybe like that. Although honestly, I mostly listen to podcasts when I'm in the studio. But yeah, I mean, I can when I think about like if my painting was a particular kind of music, like I feel like that's the kind that I like, where it's really
Yeah.
about kind of really about those formal components.
Definitely.
I mean, I think like it is important that the imagery is, nature. Uh, if honestly, if there was a way for me to make, if I knew how to make an abstract painting, like maybe I would, but I'm so kind of like steeped in having imagery and like laying out the space in a certain way and a horizon line and always
Hmm.
having those things to kind of ground it.
Yeah.
But I'm also not the kind of figurative painter where I'm like looking at things
Yeah.
specifically. Like I do that occasionally, and I used to do it a lot more. But at this point, with the body of work that I started, that I'm kind of working on now, that I started in 2019, like I really did kind of let go of a lot of reference, like source material, and it
Yeah.
became much more from my head.
I think that's what's so powerful about your pieces though, is like you're like you said, like you're grounding them. Like they need some sort of thread of like reference or representation in order to express like these ideas that like kind of transcend representation, that are kind of like woven underneath the surface of things. Like I think about when I look at your work, there's this magical childlike like wonder that like is instilled in me when I look at them, and yet they're so refined at the same time. And I think you strike this really interesting balance between those two, where it has this whimsical forms, like the way, like one of my favorite things that you do is the way you illustrate like waves in the water. Like they're
Mhm.
so whimsical and they have such a character quality to them. But they're also illustrating like the rhythm of the ocean and this sort of magical sort of cosmic like timescape that is sort of played out through tides and through the way that the waves are just constantly coming in. And I just find this balance that you're achieving to be so interesting.
Hmm.
Because like it's obvious, like if you wanted them to look more realistic in any way, it's obvious you could totally do that, but like you're making these deliberate choices to kind of distill the imagery into more simplistic forms. And I think it's from that that the color and the radiance of the color and the shifts in value through color really shine. And they kind of speak, at least for me personally, to this sense of like something beyond the natural, but yet still connected to it. Is that something you think about like when you're constructing your compositions? Like, is this something you kind of figure it out beforehand before you execute it as a painter? Like, or do
Yeah,
you?
yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Yeah, I do studies. So sometimes I'll do them on the iPad or even on like a little drawing app on my
Cool.
phone. Yeah, and then I also do studies, like just paint on paper with the same paints that I use on the panels, on paper. So, or sometimes I'll like sketch something out in a sketchbook to kind of get the idea for the composition. And then the study is an opportunity to sort of figure out what I want to do with the color. I mean,
Mhm.
they're really like driven by the color. That's kind of like the primary idea for each
Mhm.
painting. It's pretty like the color. I kind of need both a color idea and a composition idea, but sometimes all I have is a color idea.
Right.
But like yeah. So the color is kind of the driving force. But yeah, I mean, I love Henri Rousseau and folk art paintings. I love a kind of like almost simplistic or childlike way of depicting the world. Like I think that's what's interesting about painting as opposed to photography, is that it is like like the world filtered through like a human mind. um,
Mhm.
so I feel like that's kind of what is cool about folk art or Henri Rousseau, or I mean tons of other artists fall
Yeah,
into
it's
that
like this
category.
playful quality, it's like you're kind of pushing the boundaries of like how you can represent something. And yet it also express like these sort of formal concerns like you speak of like color and sort of like form composition, like the way that like we think about like horizon lines or like space, foreground, or background. And you kind of play with these formal qualities, but there is still like this other thing that happens when you put all them together, that I think, even though there is a logic to it, like, you speak about that, there's something else happening to them that I think transcends that logic. And I don't know, it speaks to me deeply about trying to get outside of like the literal part of my mind and to like see a new way of feeling a landscape. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
almost like expressing like even though you speak like getting away from the emotion, like I get personally, because again, you can't control what the viewer
Yeah,
gets.
yeah.
But for me, I get an emotional quality to it because it's sort of defying my expectations about how color should be used, or
Hmm.
how a certain form should appear. And I don't know if like you have that experience like when you're painting, like where there is like this relationship between like your color choices and a certain type of emotion or energy that you feel in relationship to the subject? Is that just kind of something secondary that maybe just comes, after the fact? Because I think as painters, like a lot of things can happen that we're not really aware of until later. You know what I mean?
I mean, I do think like uh, it's, I think there definitely is like I want them to have impact, and so I think there is certainly going to be an emotional experience because I mean I do want that. I want them to have this kind of like strength and intensity, um, but also, yeah. I mean, I feel like I have kind of gravitated to certain colors that sort of like make sense within this world of like water and air and clouds.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'm kind of trying to push beyond that too. Like I'm making, because I think up until now, like I don't have a lot of red in the paintings.
Mm.
Like not a lot of like saturated red, but now I am working on a red painting, and I'm sort of thinking about like, oh, but maybe if you're in this world that's like a red world, like the magenta and the orange and the different shades of red within that actually all functions the same way as like a blue, gray, green painting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, I mean, I think I am just so often thinking about, I think of them as worlds that I'm kind of like inhabiting for the time of creating the painting. And, the sun having like a very kind of symbolic shape with like symbolic looking, rays, and then the waves having like a very like a very particular form that is yeah, it's not real natural
Mm-hmm.
looking, but
Yeah.
it still has a form, like it's still like the light and shadow and the color shifts within the water all are like building that space, like because that's always what the color is doing, is kind of like there's a color shift from I'm thinking about the space in the painting, like in the front of the painting, there's going to be one color thing happening, and then that's going to gradually move back along the water, to like to show that the space is moving front or
Mm.
back. And also to challenge that, like maybe the hot color is in the back and the cool color is in the front, or instead, like, but I'm always like geeking out on like atmospheric perspective and
Yeah.
like kind of creating space with color.
Yeah, I like the way you adjust like the chroma of your paint in certain ways that you create depth, like just kind of in some paintings, like where there's specific areas where you're kind of toning down the saturation so
Mhm.
that then the saturated qualities like really shine, through that juxtaposition, like where you kind of, do you know what I'm saying? And I think
Yeah. Well, a
waves.
lot of, I mean, one of my kind of like go to, I don't want to say tricks, but it's like a go to kind of like fun place I like to hang out in is basically having one really bright, one color, one, saturated color, and another saturated color. And then there's a gradation, like all the different gradations between them. And then in the middle, it often goes really gray.
Hmm.
So if it's like red, turn, from going from red to green. So in the middle it gets gray, because also, I mean, I used to paint really with a more kind of like all over saturated palette. And I used to use like a whole bunch of different pigments in each painting. And now I really only use three
Hmm.
generally. So that's a super important part of it, is there's always three pigments plus white. And so it's like
Wow.
kind of like that, the triad of those three colors in the painting, and then what they're doing, and like kind of,
Yeah.
like sometimes like I'm working on one now and it's like orange, yellow ochre, and violet. And like those three, like the violet is operating as the blue, and the orange is operating as a red, and the yellow ochre
Mm.
is operating as a yellow. So there's sort of like,
Yeah.
things do break out into like primary colors in that world, but they're also not primary colors. So it gives the whole thing like a weird cast, you know?
Yes, I love that. I think that's amazing. And I think it's always incredible. It's really hard, I think, as artists, especially who use a lot of color, to find ways to limit ourselves. And so, even just by like limiting yourself through your pigment choice, I think that's a brilliant move because you're going to stumble across these combinations that are maybe unexpected and that create a different kind of resonance in the paintings than you might have built before. So, because I think we always got to keep ourselves interested, right? And so kind of being like a chemist, like a scientist, like experimenting and playing with what are the possibilities of color, because for me color is inherently emotional in some way. And so like the way that you implement it is going to charge that space with a different kind of mood no matter what, but like when you can kind of stumble across these kind of like weird intermediary colors that kind of transition you from one to another and these kind of liminal spaces, they end up being like the key to making everything else work in some subtle way. And so for me personally, whenever I discover like some of those colors, like it's just like a revelation of like the relative nature of our experience of color, and that these things are all singing and communicating together, and you are putting together a symphony of light waves in some sense, and I definitely appreciate like that like level of thought that goes into your color palettes. I didn't really pick up on that like looking at them, but now like when I go back to look at them, I'm going to try to like
Figure out
decipher a
what they
little
are.
bit. Yeah, like what those pigments are.
Yeah.
I'm an art teacher. I teach art. I don't know if you've ever taught art on your, creative
A
journey.
little bit, a lot,
Yeah.
like a while ago, but yeah,
and
briefly.
and so like something I always try to get my artists to like become more and more conscious of is just, pigment decisions. Like, there's not just one kind of blue out there, there's a million, and they do different things depending on how you mix them or use them. And so getting them to become more knowledgeable about like the various pigments that are out there is like such a crucial step. So any artist out there, like, really get to know your pigments and
Mhm.
explore sort of how they can create nuances in the way you
Yeah.
use color. Um,
Yeah,
in
no,
ter-
the art, yeah, it's yeah, the pigments and how they act and how they mix, like
yeah,
they work. Yeah, because I'm working on one painting right now, and I'm using ultramarine blue and then this color called permanent green light. And ultramarine blue is like actually sort of a terrible mixer, so the like color into, they're both like these, very vibrant. It's a very vibrant blue, a very vibrant green, but you mix them together and they become like gray, like this
yeah.
kind of gray teal color that is like not what you would expect.
I know,
But
because it's the warmth, like color temperature,
right,
is
yeah, the
so
warmth and
crucial. So
agree.
like the warmth of that ultramarine blue, like students are always
Yeah,
trying to make violet and they work with ultramarine, which you can get great violets, but they're like, a lot of, younger artists like want to get like the brightest violet. I'm like,
yeah, yeah,
that's not the best pigment to use. Like, what do you mean?
yeah,
I'm like, you gotta, you know,
yeah.
try cerulean blue,
Yeah, yeah, right.
like
Like that,
those,
there's sort of unexpected, like
Yeah.
what is a good mixer. But then I like it when I've got one that's kind of a bad mixer because then you get like some interesting grades.
Exactly.
Kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You can play with it more, at the end of the day, they're just kind of like tools for us. And we want to get excited about the way we experiment with
yeah,
them, I'm
yeah.
curious, like in your process as an artist, like, do you build in any kind of like ritual in the way that you paint? Like, how do you like when you enter your studio, like, do you have like a certain rhythm or ritual and way that you like approach making work? Because to be working like you are, like you're got to be in the studio pretty often, I would imagine. I was
Yeah,
curious if you build any of that kind of stuff for yourself.
I mean, so I've got two kids who are pretty young. They're 4 and 8.
I
So,
have a 4-year-old.
oh, you do? Oh,
I know how
nice,
that
nice,
is.
nice. Yeah, I mean, so prior to getting into the studio, I'm like getting them ready, like brushing their hair, like getting them dressed, feeding them breakfast, and then my husband takes them to school, um and then I guess I usually exercise, and then I go into the studio, and yeah, I mean, so I like change out my water from the day before. Like I never do it at the end of the day. I always do it in the morning. So I
Oh,
like
cool.
rinse out my jar for water, and make sure I've got water to drink out there, because my studio is in the garage. It used to be, we converted it from a garage to a studio, but it's
Oh, sweet.
behind the house. So there's no plumbing in there. So I always have to like kind of bring in water to drink and water to use on the,
And
well,
don't
for,
mix them up. Done that
right.
before. Picked
Yeah.
up the wrong cup.
Yeah, no, that's not good. Yeah, so usually I do that, and then I get in there and I kind of just sit usually and look at the painting for a few minutes and remember. Honestly, I think there is just a like shedding of like sort of because there's so much stuff going on all the time with my kids that I'm like on my phone, like, oh,
Mhm.
this is happening, there's this dentist appointment and blah 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 blah. And so I feel like there's a certain amount of just like letting that like fall away a
Yeah.
bit and just like be in the quiet of the studio and like enjoy that, like the alone, like I kind of love. I when I first started working in my studio full time, I was like worried about being lonely in there, but now I just like relish it.
Yeah.
So
It is
yeah,
like a sacred space, for you
yeah,
to like that quietness, like, is I appreciate that too. I need that, I consider myself to be kind of like an ambivert, like I can be very
uh,
extroverted when I want to be, but like I need my introversion. I think that's what draws me personally to making art and
yeah,
painting. But like for me, it's like this sacred space. I love how you like describe it as just like falling away of like all the other roles you play. It's
yeah,
like you play all these different roles in your life outside of like your real like individualized focused or passion.
hmm,
And you have to be able at times to separate yourself from those things so that you can really concentrate and fully be like open in your senses to like what the painting's asking of you or what it is you need to kind of push toward in the studio that day. So I think that
yeah,
kind of that you just saying that, like, I can resonate a lot with that because like, we all wear many hats in our life. But this one as painters, like, we have to really like learn how to let go of everything else so we can be clear in our mind and really attentive to this dialogue that we have. I mean, that's how I look at painting as the dialogue,
yeah,
painting's always speaking like what it needs or what it doesn't want, and you have to be present to like listen to it.
yeah,
um,
yeah.
do you think
Well,
like your exercise, like your time is when you exercise before, is a way to like kind of begin that process of like clearing out your mind some? I feel like for a lot of people, exercise can do that. Like it can kind of be like a way to just let go of tension in the mind where this attachment to certain thoughts or things that are going on and be able to loosen that up a little bit. Do you feel that maybe that's why you seem to do it, or is it just the only time you can get it in for the day?
I mean, it literally is the only time I can get it
Yeah.
in. But yeah, I mean, I think at this point, I actually exercise, like I kind of exercise with friends 3 days a week. So it actually has become a really, actually pretty social part of my day. That's like
Great.
almost like my most reliable time to see, a few close friends. But then, yeah, if I'm like going for a walk by myself, then yeah, it is probably a more kind of like peaceful. But yeah, honestly, it is often like, because sometimes I'm like walking back from the school or something with a couple parent friends. So yeah, I mean, I would say on the weekend, like if I go out by myself and I go for a long walk, like, yeah, it definitely is like, you know, kind of clearing my head. And yeah, I think just like movement is just like sort of a crucial part of every day for me to like
Yeah.
not be a crazy person, like not to be like an anxious like cranky mess. So
Yeah, I feel the same way. I
yeah,
think even like
yeah,
even if it's a social thing you're doing, I think just moving your body intentionally, for the sake of just moving your body so that, it just really it moves energy around, and it clears
yeah,
things up. Um
yeah.
do you ever like explore meditative practices or anything like that as a way to like clear your mind or a way to
Yeah,
like center yourself? Is that something that you're interested in?
yes, yes. And I have meditated on a regular basis at times. I find it's really hard for me to keep it going
Mhm.
with kids.
Yeah.
Like if I went out to the studio, I like one of the times I was doing it, I would like do it in my studio once I got out there at the beginning of the day for like 10 minutes. And I should. It's one of those things like every couple days I'm like, man, I should really meditate. Like, like I know it makes me feel better. Like I should just do it. And
Yeah.
it's like hard for me to get that habit going. And I think before I had kids, like I would often do that in the morning. And I think it is, yeah, really good.
Yeah.
Really
Well, even your
good.
painting, like, because I'm looking at the way that you paint, it seems very meditative because it's so regimented. Like, it's kind of, you're talking about repeating these
Mhm.
patterns or these bands of color. Like, there is that woven into it. And I
Yeah.
think that a meditative practice is something that, like, ultimately the formal practice, like the sitting cross-legged or whatever, this is
Hmm.
great. This is really good. But ultimately, it's got to be a part of your life. It's got to leave that space and be a part of what you do. So I think for me, that's the point of those formal practices in a lot of contexts, is to like initiate you into shifting your relationship with your own mind, so you're not caught by the webs of repetitive thinking or attached to like certain ways that you judge not only yourself, but the world,
Yeah.
and so we can like soften those and those like harder edges in our mind and also let go of some of those attachments. Then like we clear a lot of that space out. But I think painting obviously has got to do some of that work too. But I was just curious because I look at your painting, they do have a meditative feeling to them as well. Like I feel like when I look at them, I want to meditate on them. I want to like experience them for longer periods of time. Sadly, I've never seen one in person, but I can see through the screen. I can only imagine how much even more powerful they are at scale, with real like light reflecting off of the actual pigment back into my mind body, like
Yeah.
them being like very entrancing and very meditative. I think that's what drew me to reach out to you for this podcast, because I've always loved your work, but I've always personally felt that quality seeping out of them in some way, like you, because of a lot of the things we've already spoken about, the way that you're shifting our understanding of these natural forms and playing with color in these very specific ways, like it's already heightening this experience visually. But there's still a calmness to it as well. It's interesting. It's an interesting experience to have, at least through the screen. It's like there's such intensity and color and form, but yet there's also still like this quietness to them in some
Hmm.
ways. Has anyone else ever like expressed that to you about them? Have you ever like felt that they
Yeah.
were?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, somebody actually told me recently that she owns she's a collector or she's not, it's not all she is, but not to reveal who she is, but anyway,
Yeah,
she
yeah.
told me she owns painting and she does yoga in front of it, like it's in her like room where she does yoga, and she sort of like like does yoga sort of toward the painting, which I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's so nice, but
I would do
yeah,
that too.
yeah, like I definitely, I meditation, I think it is one of those things that I would love to have in my life when my children are a little bit older and my
Yeah.
schedule is a little bit less hectic. And yeah, I think
Yeah.
um
You can find ways to weave it in, even though, even like, I think a big pitfall people have when they want to begin meditation practice is to try to bite off too much, too soon. Like, even like 3 minutes, literally 3 minutes of just like mindful breathing before you even begin to dump the water and get your brushes set up and set down, just like walking in, like even something like that, doing that every day. I mean,
mhm.
that can literally do magic. And it's just literally 180 seconds, but it's
Yeah,
easier
yeah,
said than done. You got to build that sort of habit to
yeah.
them. But yeah, I can totally see someone wanting to do yoga or meditate on your work or in front of it, because again, we're talking about like these elemental principles of like earth, sky, water,
Mhm.
air. But then you have like the ether of like the cosmos, like this, like especially the way you do stars and the way they radiate out. Some of your more recent paintings, at least from 2021 on your website, with like the
Yeah.
starscapes and stuff, like there is this when I look at them, there is this sort of, um, I don't know, it feels like an homage to the natural world in a very like unique sort of way that's all your own, you know? And
Yeah.
so, like, for me, I can totally see and feel a spiritual quality to them, even though if that's not really what's driving the making of them, it just seems to come naturally out of the choices you make. Um,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
something I really appreciate a lot about what you're doing with your work, because I don't know, it's something I feel personally that we need more of. You know,
Yeah.
we need more of this connection to the natural world. We need more of this prioritizing of creating spaciousness in our lives so that we're not busy, 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 busy all the time. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. I think that, I think there's such a tendency to sort of be on your phone all the time or be constantly interrupted with texts and, to have just like this, and I think also having kids, there's just like this hecticness
mhm.
all the time, or like my house is like constantly being destroyed by my kids, and yeah, I think my work did become more minimal after I had, like, I mean, it was probably about 3 years ago that I started this body of work, and I did have the feeling of like really wanting the work to be more minimal,
Mhm.
because, well, also we like moved into our house 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago, and then we started like living with our art more, and I was living with my paintings and then living with like my husband's work and some other people's work, or like our friends' work that we'd traded for over the years, and just started to realize what it was like to live with something and what different colors felt like to live with, and I just was realizing that I was kind of longing for more simplicity in the work
Mm.
at the same time as having like a busy hand and wanting to make lots of details and kind of like, like combing across the surface is something that is like also like soothing to me, like an important part of the process, an important part of it being like my thing that I made. That, and actually like going back, this is actually something I've been wanting to talk to my daughter about. She's extremely creative and always making things, but she will spend like, 5 minutes on something and then like toss it aside and make the next thing, toss it aside. And I remember being in school, like in grad school, and like making lots of things that I wasn't necessarily spending a lot of time on.
Mm.
And then at the end of grad school, like my studio was on the second floor and there was a dumpster right outside the window. And I was just like throwing things into the dumpster. And I think like moving to New York City and like living in apartments, not having a lot of space, I started making like small paintings and spending a really long time on them,
Wow.
so that like they're, rather than making like 10 paintings that like didn't amount to much that I was just going to throw away anyway, I'd rather make like one painting that I really like spent a lot of time on, that, and then keep it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was sort of like an important ingredient to like what my work is now, is that sort of like, combing across the whole surface and having an idea and kind of a, sort of a plan for the whole surface.
Yeah.
Um, at the same time, but then this other piece of like simplicity, or I don't want to say minimalism because I really don't think my work is minimalist, but
Yeah.
just like a more kind of cohesive idea with the color, like
Yeah.
a simple, cohesive idea.
Well, you're like kind of distilling things, you know, you're trying to, it's a distillation process. Like you're like trying to let go of all the things that aren't necessary to like what your vision is. And I think
Yeah,
this idea of like spending time on one thing and like really dedicating, devoting yourself to like executing it and giving the painting what it needs and not trying to rush to the next thing is so crucial.
yeah,
I feel the same way, but like even if it's something that is maybe more of a simple composition, um your attention to detail is still so like important. So even if it is relatively a simple composed image, every little detail matters that much more, in terms of the way that you're like you said, like kind of combing through like the whole surface.
Hmm.
And I think there's something really important to be said for that, because we do live in sort of like, this world where it's like that instant gratification. It's like swipe left, swipe right, up, down, like on to the next, on to the next, on to the next. And like our attention spans are becoming so narrowed. And I
Hmm.
think it's from that process that we're actually like handicapping our own consciousness in some way. And
Hmm.
so, like, painting the way that you're painting and like making art and really dedicating yourself to slowing down and refining all the aspects of the painting that need to be refined and thought through is sort of fighting back against all the sort of momentum that our culture is pushing on you to, like, be distracted. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think there's the distracted thing. I also think like we're all inundated by stuff, like just junk in the home. Like it's so easy to buy things. Things like clothing is really inexpensive, and also with kids, like there's this constant influx of toys and
Yeah.
things they're bringing home, and I feel like there's a it's like, okay, what objects do I actually want to have around me? And I want to
Right.
really be aware of what those objects are and like have them be, like the like Marie Kondo life-changing magic of tidying up. Like that was, I feel like that was an important thing. It's almost like, and it's almost like I did that to the paintings too. Like
Yeah.
what really needs to be here,
Exactly.
and like there can be less in this painting at the
Yeah.
same time that there's like a self-soothing kind of activity that I need to do to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's so important. Like, I think it's like in a time like, and we're very fortunate and very lucky and privileged in the world that we live in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In terms of the Western world, America, like the height of consumerist, conquest that's happening here. Like,
Yeah.
anything is at our fingertips at the push of a button. And so I think it begs the question, what is it that we really value?
And
Like,
what does it mean to be a person who makes things, who's like putting out more things into the world, like
it's
they
a
better
great
not
question.
be, like, but yeah, because like moving to New York and like living in small apartments and not having room, it's like if I'm gonna add another thing, like I don't want to be like carting around, also I think for many years I just sold my work for like really cheap or gave it away to friends because I just didn't I like dreaded storing things to the point
Yeah.
of like I have almost nothing. Like I have no pain from like literally the last 10 years, like none.
Wow.
They're all gone, and which I now like really regret. But
Yeah. But they're living their lives somewhere, they're serving their purpose in some sense.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's a great question, Amy. Like as being people who make things, like, we have to be even more conscious about what it is we're adding to the just the abundance of stuff that exists
Yeah.
around us. And so that's why I'm drawn to your work, because I think it asks me to slow down and asks me, when I look at it, to connect to like this childlike magical reality that is woven into the mundane, consumerist materialist paradigm that sort of runs the everyday world that we have to live in, the bills we have to pay, all the things we have to do. Like, it reminds me that there's more. And because it
Mhm.
reminds me of that imaginal realm of the mind, in this sort of sense that everything that we're doing, we're creating, and we can create anything we want. It's just a matter of choice and what we're choosing to, like, put our energy into, what we're choosing to invest in. And I think
Yeah.
that's going to be a big question moving into the future for everyone to contemplate, is like, what is it that we truly value in terms of stuff? Because it's obvious we can get whatever we want whenever we want, and that doesn't equal happiness. Or
Right. And it is this kind of like empty Yeah, like buying things is this sort of like empty self-soothing, like I've
Right.
thought about that. Like, yeah, there are certain ways that we try to make ourselves feel better that are kind of like empty and short-lived, like, scrolling on your phone, or like buying a
Hmm.
new pair of jeans or
And waiting
whatever.
for it to come in the mail. Like, you got this cool thing on Amazon. Like, oh, I can't wait on Tuesday. It's coming. I can't wait to see it. You open it up. Here it is.
Yeah, and then it's like,
Okay.
oh, this time. Yeah, yeah, then that thrill.
uh,
Yeah. So, but like actually making stuff, I feel like was this sort of like deeply satisfying thing where I could spend, 4 hours in the studio or something and come out feeling better, like in a long
yes.
lasting way.
Kind of a paradox there. It's like we are making something material and it is stuff. Ultimately, that has to go somewhere, but it's not like, I don't know. The human touch is a powerful thing in my mind. Even just like the decision making of an individual to create something is like that to me is like our ultimate power and gift is like humanity is this ability to manifest something that hadn't existed before. But
Yeah.
with any power, we can misuse it, and I think that's what we see a lot of today is this misuse of this innate creative capacity that is the human mind and the human species. And so I think we are in a time where we have to ask these big questions. And I look at artists like yourself as like kind of in some way are planting seeds of like shifting that consciousness in some way. That's at least my personal view. And so I'm really grateful for you and the work that you make and the sort of energy you put out there, the beauty you create, the magical sort of, I don't know, imaginal, mysterious sort of creations that come out of your studio. I think for me, it's not adding to the mess of stuff. It's adding to like, it's shifting our sense of value of what stuff is actually of value. And I think things like that to me, that's valuable because it's speaking to something beyond just the material. It's speaking something about the human spirit. And I think that's what we need to reconnect with personally and on the deepest level possible in a time where it's very confusing for a lot of people to navigate. So
Yeah.
I extend a ton of gratitude to you and the work that you're making. And I'm excited to see what comes next. I'm loving these new paintings you've done that are kind of these windows, these sort of frames you're creating, like,
Oh,
at least
with
a
the
couple,
clouds.
yeah, or with like the foliage,
Oh
one that
yeah, yeah.
the
Well, the
recent
tree
one.
ones are new. Yeah, the ones with trees
Yeah.
are newer.
I think
Yeah.
that's cool too, like creating these like frames within a frame, these windows into these worlds. Like, so I'm excited to see where it comes next. And I'm grateful for you to spend time with me today just to chat. We got into some really good little nerdy details about art making, which is what I love, but also
Yeah,
some
yeah.
some bigger ideas that I'm going to be thinking about after this conversation for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
been super fun to chat with you also. I feel like it was good. I feel like we talked about some stuff I don't usually talk about, so it's
that's
good.
great. Awesome. Well, it's great
Yeah,
connecting with
yeah.
you and thanks again. And look forward to seeing what, like I said, what comes out of your studio next. So keep it
Oh
up.
yeah, and sorry, let
Yeah,
me
for
give you
sure.
one plug.
Yeah, for sure.
My next show is coming up in March at Sperone Westwater here in New York. So if
Awesome.
anyone's listening wants to check that out, it's opening March 3rd.
Awesome. In the show notes, y'all, I'll have a lot of links, not only to like Amy's social media and her website, but I'll have links for that show. And
Great.
anything else you want to add to there, we can talk later. We can add to the show notes for it. But thanks again so much, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Great chatting with you, Amy.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks so much.
All right, peace.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Concerning the Spiritual and Art. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch and in tune with all the amazing offerings that we're going to be bringing to this channel. Thanks again for all your support. Super grateful and excited to bring more content your way. Peace, y'all.